Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about a lot of different things. I'm going to start with storytelling, but I'm going to talk about those videos which have been coming out from Disney, which was a leaked Zoom meeting from Disney's Imagine Tomorrow, which is their inclusion division, which I've been following for a while. And in a roundabout way, I'm going to go deep into it. I'm going to answer the question, why in the world do they have to take all of the characters that you love so much and turn them into pronoun people? And adjacent to that, whether or not this is going to get any better or worse in the future. So I'm going to link in the description the videos where these come from. They come from Christopher Rufo's Twitter site. He's releasing them little bits at a time, so there's no big compilation of them as of yet. Even today, this morning, he's been dropping new ones. And before I begin, I just want to say this will probably touch on everything that my audience wants to be here for. There's different sections of you, I know, because I'm going to start with storytelling. I'm going to move from there into the philosophical, from there into the political, and from there back to storytelling, because really the whole thing is interconnected. So first off, to answer the question, is this going to get any better or worse in the future? Well, it's definitely going to get worse. And this is a statement coming out from Disney, not just within these videos that have been released, but also within a statement from Disney's Reimagine Tomorrow itself. I'll flash that up on the screen right now and read it for you very quickly for those who don't watch the screen. It says, under the heading of Our Intention, to establish inclusion standards across all Disney general entertainment content. And it goes on to say, by 2022, 50% of regular and recurring characters across Disney general entertainment scripted content will come from unrepresented groups. And within those videos themselves, the director of content expressed this exact same sentiment, but she was talking more generally about the fact that she was going to make this 50% basically pronoun people. Not just what they would say, people of color or disabled people. No, she's focusing on the pronoun people. That's what she wants to make, a minimum of 50% of the main and reoccurring characters within all Disney general entertainment. And really, I deal mostly with comics when I'm talking about entertainment, and that's already happened for most of comics. If you look at something like DC, which isn't owned by Disney, but Marvel is, you have as pronoun people now the new Superman, the new Aquaman. Wonder Woman has been made so. Batman kind of escaped, but the Robin, who has been his Robin since about 1995, has been made one of these pronoun people. So it's just everywhere within these companies. And certainly if you get Disney saying Disney General Entertainment, and therefore all of their companies that they control, which includes Marvel, ESPN, and so many more that I can't even list them all. I'll try to flash something up on the screen for you to show you just how many. All of these are going to concentrate on minimum 50% main and reoccurring characters of this type. So the question then moves on to, first of all, what's the problem with this? And second of all, why would they be doing this? And I think the answer to those two questions can be done at the same time. So the answer to this question came within part of this Zoom meeting itself. One of the other people participating in this Zoom meeting, a fellow who was working with their animation department, actually gives the answer for this and why they need to concentrate on this so much. And I think a lot of people are skipping over what seems to be very small little answer that he gives, which means massive things, which I'm going to go over. And by the way, for those of you who follow me because of the comic content, this has a direct connection to the comics. Why? Because this fellow who gave the answer, what is he working on? He's working on the new animation for Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, which is a Marvel comic character, which came out as part of the Marvel Comics as their new inclusion initiative several years ago. So again, I'll link in the description his little snippet from this Zoom meeting, but I'll give you the translated version of what he said. Basically, he says that if you're going to include people, well, that's all well and good. But you can include people, say, people of color, and I hate using that term, but that's what they use, or other visible groups, and you can put them in the background and they can be recognized. And they're already doing this. Other presenters say, yes, we're already doing that. We're putting these characters in the background. But for the people he's talking about, the people he represents, he's saying that these people, these pronoun people, because their reason for being marginalized is because of something internal, you can't just put that on the screen as a background character. So, because they're so diverse, and they're so diverse that they need practically every letter in the alphabet just as an acronym for the people within their community, because there is no norm, or certainly no normal way to show them as this, then you can't just stick them in the background and say that's representation. Therefore, if you want to take pronoun people and put them in as representation in these shows, they must be the central character, or at the very least, someone who is close enough to the central character that they can express exactly who they are and why they are there. Now, by the way, this plays into an idea which has been kicking around for a long time. It comes from third wave feminism. It's called erasure. So these pronoun people think that and believe that, and it's part of their literature, that if you put them in the background so they're not the center of the attention, then that's erasure of who they are. They see this as actual persecution more than if you didn't include them at all. Because you're saying, yes, they're there, but we're going to ignore them. That's, in their minds, what it is saying, to put pronoun people into your stories in the background. It does not work. So therefore, they must be in the foreground, and not only that, but in the foreground in a way where they have to be, well, let's just say, a flaming queen. Why? Because that's the only way that their identity is not erased. You can't say as a character, oh, I'm of this persuasion, and not openly and flamingly act like that as a character. Otherwise, that would be persecution of who they are. Whether it be from outside or internal, it doesn't matter. So, when they say they want at least 50% of these people as representation within the main or central characters of all of their entertainment, they mean it as the main or central character, and their identity will be the entire revolving point of the plot or the story. Because A, if you don't make it that, it's erasure and then persecution, and B, the only way that you can represent them on screen is by making them the center. Now, I'm going to go a little bit into the philosophical here and talk about why this is, not according to how they view themselves, but how I would say, if you look at this rationally and logically, what is going on here. So, there was a study that came out a couple of years ago. I did a video about it a while ago. If I can scrounge it up, I'll link that in the description as well, where it talked about the fact that the further left you go on the political spectrum, the more and more you get people that identify with what they call Dark Triad traits. And basically what that means is they become narcissists, and the farther left you move, they turn from narcissists into sociopaths and psychopaths. So I'm going to go over the why and how of this right now, and not talk about it in a psychological way or according to that study, but according to the original concepts of what Western civilization is built upon, which are the ideas of vice and virtue, which is what I'm always talking about because I'm talking about usually a hero, which is a paragon of virtue. But I'm going to set that aside just for today and talk about virtue and vice themselves for a few minutes. So first of all, let's talk about how a human being actually works. Fundamentally, we'll get the baseline and then see how these people skew off of the baseline, which in turn makes them self-centered and narcissists. The baseline is as follows. As a human being, you are a human being. Sorry for anybody who thinks otherwise, who thinks that they can take their emotions and determine what they are. You cannot. Reality is what reality is. You're a human being, and therefore you have a human nature. That is to say, everyone who is a part of the species of human has the same nature. And by extent, if you could change something, add something to, or take away from what your human nature is, you would no longer be of the species of human. And that, according to reality, simply cannot be. And you certainly cannot do so by your feelings. And part of human nature, well, really the nature of any creature, but human nature specifically, is the fact that we seek fulfillment. And that's what we are doing when we are trying to fulfill our human nature. We're seeking fulfillment. And how we do that is by looking at that end point of what our human nature is and fulfilling what it says we should be. So basically, you look at what I'm always talking about. You look at reality and man's existence within reality and his own reality. That is to say, his own existence. You look at those things and see what constitutes human happiness according to how we exist and what our endpoint is, which is determined by our human nature. Now, very briefly, how do we do this? Well, we do this by being pattern recognizers. That's what we are as human beings, and that's really what reason and logic are. They're a system of pattern recognition, and we're very good at pattern recognition. And really, all of creation, all animals and plants even, we all follow patterns, and the higher ones of us actually can recognize a pattern within what the patterns of reality actually are. Let me give you a brief example of this, which I find terribly funny. A number of years ago, this was decades ago probably, there was a bunch of scientists and they got together and they were studying trees. And they discovered that basically you can apply mathematical algorithms to the way that tree branches grow. They always grow in a very specific pattern. Now, for different trees, they have different kinds of patterns. There's offshoots and variations of these patterns, but there is a basic mathematical formula of which tree branches will grow. And they came to the conclusion after a little while when someone took this formula and applied it to art, then they looked at Celtic art and said, hey, look, these old Celtic drawings, they can also be reduced to these mathematical formulas. And the rest of us out here in the world who are not blinded by simply looking at science went, no kidding, did you not know this? We've known this for a long time. This is what the Celts do. If you look at something like the Book of Kells, when you look at Celtic manuscripts, and they have all of these patterns, these twisty, windy patterns, what are they? They're tree branches. Why? Because these people lived in dense, old-growth forests, and so what they knew best was the dense, old-growth trees around them, and so this seeped into their artistic nature, and that's what they began to represent. They knew the pattern instinctually, most probably, that was all around them of tree branch growing, and so they put it into their art. And I say all that, A, to show you that no, you don't need heavy mathematical and scientific equations in order to figure this out. Early people have figured this out a long time ago, being very good pattern recognizers. And B, we take this pattern recognition and put it into almost everything within our lives, certainly within the art that we produce. And the pattern recognition of reason and logic is applied to our fulfillment. And we do it, as I said, we look at our human nature, use it as the ends, and the ends determines the beginning point, and then it determines how we get from the beginning to that end. And so we use this pattern recognition to figure all of these things out. And therefore, when we can get from point A, which is the beginning, to point Z, which is the end, that constitutes our fulfillment. Now, how do we do that? Well, we do that through virtue. Because quite literally, this is one of the definitions of virtue itself. It's the power to accomplish our ends. And if you know anything really about virtue and what it is, this is no surprise, because virtue itself is a pattern recognition, is based upon the pattern recognition of right reason and good decision-making, which is prudence. And so you look at the reality around you, you understand it as it actually exists, you understand the patterns within it, and therefore you make good decisions, which are the center of virtues around all of this pattern recognition and all of these expressions of reality, not just reality around you, but within you, and how they both connect together. And just to stress that point, virtue can be defined as the power to accomplish one's ends. So stick that in your brain for a little bit later, the power to do so. Now you see, this entire thing, this entire system is based upon pattern recognition of reality. But if we move back to that fellow's statements that I was just talking about, what he is basically saying is there is no normal for these people. And again, if we look at something like the statements of Sana Amanat, who was the director of content for Marvel Comics, when she was introducing Barack Obama, she made the exact same kind of statement, stating that there is no normal anymore. So under that, what then happens? If there is no norm by which you can understand things, then, therefore, you cannot understand the pattern of things. But actually, let me take a step back just for one moment. This all really generates itself from the liberal ideal. The liberal ideal, well, what it got morphed into, really, originally it was supposed to be liberating yourself from what is not true, but it soon morphed into liberating oneself from any and all restrictions that are upon you at all, so that you become a sovereign individual, and you only submit yourself to the rules that you give the stamp of okay, saying, yes, I want to submit myself to these rules, and that's the only way they actually exist or have power over me. But here's the thing, when you have that mindset that nothing will have power over me unless I say so, you destroy the idea of a human nature. Why? Because human nature itself imposes itself upon every one of us. because you didn't choose to be born, neither did you choose to be human, but that's what you are. So too bad you have a human nature. So these people see the idea of human nature as being something that is imposing itself upon them and therefore must be discarded, at the very least mentally discarded, because really they can't do so in reality. So they mentally discard the idea of human nature itself, again, because it has a fixed point and it fixes you and every human being to the ends that it sets up, and they see that as restrictive and therefore contrary to the liberation of the liberal mentality. They either try to discard the idea of human nature itself or say, no, we understand there's a human nature, but I have to okay it myself, which is basically 6 of one, half dozen of another. It's the exact same thing, just gone through a couple of more steps. And if you discard the idea of human nature, which is the end point, then, since the end point determines your beginning point, which is logically and rationally how it works, then you no longer have that beginning point as well, nor do you have the ability to move from one to the other in order to gain fulfillment. Therefore, first of all, what are you left with? Well, you're left with people who still want fulfillment because they're still human, and that's what human beings try to do. Really, that's what all creatures try to do. We seek our own fulfillment. But since they discard the idea of the endpoint, they can no longer generate this pattern recognition, and therefore they no longer have access to the virtue necessary to move themselves forward towards fulfillment. What then does that leave them with? Well, that leaves them with vice, which is the opposite of virtue, because vice itself is basically a basis of lies, a basis of what is unreal, a basis of deception. Because, again, if they were to okay what is actually virtue, it is the okay stamp, the pattern recognition of what is real, what is true. But they oppose that in opposing human nature because everything that I just talked about flows from the endpoint of human nature. So they oppose that, and the only thing that they have left is vice. The only thing they concentrate on and surround themselves with are things that are basically lies. So they don't have the power necessary to actually be fulfilled. And this leads to disastrous consequences in a number of ways. Number one being the fact that if they don't have an endpoint that they can fix on, what do they make their end point? What do they make their pinnacle of fulfillment? Because they're still human beings and seek fulfillment. Well, they seek fulfillment in the self. And by the way, this is what I'm always talking about. I could go through so many giant thinkers within Western civilization and show how each of them states in their own way that this exact thing is where evil comes from. Go back to Plato. Plato says there is an evil great above all others, and it's when a person makes themselves, rather than the truth, the center of everything that they judge. Go back to Aristotle, and he says if you wish to be blessed, you make yourself a friend of the truth, and therefore if you're the opposite, then you are cursed. And these are major thinkers within the influence of everything you see around you. Plato coming up with the idea of the forms. Aristotle being the first person to express what is basic logic. And I could move on. Augustine being the person who defined what we still use almost 2,000 years later as the concept of will, said, what is an evil will? Well, an evil will is the will with itself as its own ends. Or I could go to Aquinas and go through his treatises on talking about how pride, which is self-centeredness, is what actually constitutes everything that is opposed to what is good. So again, it all boils down to the liberal ideal, that I will not be subject to anything unless I okay it. And therefore, I, me, the self, is the arbiter of everything that is right and good. Therefore, you become a narcissist, because you are the center of everything. Everything around you, everything that has value, everything you deem to be good is generated from the okay of the self. And as I said, all this leads into is vice, which necessarily destroys their ability to become fulfilled, because what they're concentrating on is something that is a lie. And therefore, every time they try to become fulfilled, because they're still human beings and they're still going to try to do so, they're going to act according to a lie, which is going to turn out really bad for them, which is going to cause them pain and suffering, which then leads them necessarily to blaming other people. Why? Because they can't blame themselves, nor can they look at themselves and say, maybe I'm wrong, because that would destroy the entire center of everything their life is based upon, which is the fact that I'm right because whatever decision I make is right. They cannot question that. That would destroy their entire system of belief, everything. So, first of all, this leads to what we see around us today, this call for systemic racism or systemic sexism or whatever it is within these institutions. It's always the institution's fault. It's always something else. Why? Because these people are trying to be fulfilled by doing something that's never going to fulfill them, and therefore, since they're never wrong, then the problem must be someone else's, either an institution or other people around them. Therefore, point your finger at them and say, they're the problem, we need to get rid of them. And secondly, since they do not have the power or ability to actually become fulfilled, but they can't see their own error in the fact that they're trying to fulfill themselves with something which will not fulfill them, they're left in a loop where all they're going to do is constantly increase what they have, which is the fulfillment of themselves by themselves. They're going to increase that exponentially over and over again, always thinking that all I got to do is make this a little bigger. All I got to do is get a little more. All I got to do is make myself more of the center, and then I'll be fulfilled. But it never works because it's contrary to reality. They don't have the virtue in order to actually do that. And so it builds and builds and builds. And by the way, since they don't have the power to do that themselves, this is why the quote-unquote progressive ideology is always centered around power. They need to have more and more and more power constantly in order to get more and more to try to fulfill themselves, which necessarily, according to what human nature actually is, can never happen. Therefore, they must always gain more and more power and always increase more and more what they're doing already because they think it will fulfill them. So just for a moment, this leads back to what I was talking about at the first, where they're saying we need 50% minimum of these people within the spotlight. These are the narcissistic people because they don't have any pattern recognition, because they recognize there is no norm for them, and therefore they have to be made the center of attention. Therefore, we need at least 50%. And if you think 50% is where they're going to stop, you're kidding yourself. They're not going to stop at 50% because it will not be enough. It is never enough because, again, they're dealing with vice. It will never fulfill them. So enough will never be enough. Now, I know this is going to be a long video, but I want to take all of that I just said, and apply it to a real world thing that we all probably know about, and that is connected with this storytelling and with Disney, and look at it and say, this is how it works out in real life. All we have to do right now is look at Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, putting forth this new legislation, which is saying that you cannot teach, and yes, I read the legislation, saying that you cannot teach children from kindergarten to grade 4 about what is basically sex education without the parents' consent. And from this, you get all of these people, these pronoun people, saying, this is against our rights. And by the way, I'll flash up on the screen all of the companies which came out and said the exact same thing, which, where did I get all of these posts from? From Disney's Reimagine Tomorrow Twitter page. Now, Ron DeSantis is saying they're just coming up with this idea that has absolutely nothing to do with this bill. They're just putting forth this false story, and they have to make it about this false story because they have nothing, and therefore that's what they're promoting. Now, with all due respect to Ron DeSantis and what he's trying to do, I don't think that's actually the case, or at the very least, what he is doing is he is presenting to the general public this idea, which is something simple that they can get behind. But honestly, if you go through all of those ideas that I just talked about, you will see exactly why these people, these quote-unquote progressives and far leftist people, actually think and understand in a way that they're looking at this bill and saying that it is going to destroy the rights of pronoun people. So first off, people are saying, look, you pronoun people, you don't know what you're talking about. You haven't read this thing to begin with, and your argument has no bearing. Why? Because it applies to people who are not of your persuasion as well. It applies to everyone. People who are just normal, straight people. They can't teach that kind of thing within the schools to these kindergartners, to grade 4s, either without the parents' consent. So how is it targeting you? How is it violating your rights? And not violating the rights of, let's say, straight people? Well, here's the answer to that question, and it's contained within that statement from the fellow at the first. You see, for normal people, people who are just straight, you have access to a way to show that yes, you are normal and this is how you express yourself. And since you have that ability to express yourself in a normal way, it's not a violation of anything that has to do with you. It's not anything that violates the existence of you nor your rights. But it doesn't work that way with these pronoun people. Why? Because, of course, they have to put front and center as part and parcel of everything they do, their narcissistic way of showing that they are the center of everything. And since their identification is the center of their being, and you have to show that because there's no norm for that, therefore it has to be there front and center with everything that they do. This, by the way, is just part of pure narcissism, it being the fact that you need to control not just everything you do, but everything that happens around you, and you even control all of the people around you so they do exactly what you say. Which, by the way, when you have people around you as a narcissist, they're called flying monkeys, which is a reference back to the Wizard of Oz. And so you see, why many of these progressive people became teachers to begin with was because of their narcissistic nature. What better way in order to make yourself the center of attention than to have a whole host of children, whether it be a couple of dozen within a class or a couple of hundred within different classes, just staring at you all day and listening to you as if you were the arbiter of truth. Back to the point of where they say this is a violation of their rights. Why do they say that? Well, because they equate existence with life. And they basically tie in a mental state to this as well to make that connection. And so we go back to the idea of erasure, the idea that it is more of a persecution to ask someone who is of a certain persuasion to actually not talk about it than to actually openly persecute them. Because what are you doing? You're asking that person to take those outside rules which someone else imposes on them and to internalize it into themselves. So the point being that if these people cannot express what is basically their narcissism and make everyone around them understand that they are the center of attention and they are who they are because of their orientation, because that's the center of their being, and they must show that because there is no norm, there is no stereotype by which they can actually express that, except for making it the center of the story, the center of the lesson, the center of everything they do. And they must do that, or it's erasure, or it's actually imposing upon them rules which subjugates them more than if it was simple open persecution. Then what do you have? You have these people saying, if you are going to say to me, I can't talk to these children about what I want to tell them, which is the center and core of my being, which is my expression, then you're going to cause me to persecute myself to the extent that I'm going to possibly take my own life, because that's the only option left to me to maintain control. And again, it's all about control. They want control of their own selves. It's back to that liberal idea. If anyone or anything seeks to impose any kind of rules upon me, that is wrong. And so they're basically saying it will force these people into a position where they will take their own lives. And since the right to life is a right, you are violating their rights by backing them into a corner whereby they can't preach to and indoctrinate these children into their own sexual identity. And by the way, nor does it matter that there's that little bit in there where it says you just need the parents' consent. Let's say you have a very woke child and the parents say, yeah, sure, you can tell them that. You can express that to them all you want. Or they have an entire class full of these kids where the parents say, no, go ahead, go right to town. You can go ahead and do that. That's not enough. Why? Because that also removes them from being the center of everything, because they need the okay from someone else. If the power and choice does not come directly from them, then they are not the ones in control, and therefore they are subject to someone else. And again, that leads back to the idea of persecution. That leads back to the idea of I'm not in control. That leads back, therefore, to their idea of violating their human rights. Again, they can't have any control over them whatsoever. So they need to be able to express themselves, not only as much as possible in any way that they wish to these children, but it needs to be their choice, and they need to be able to do it secretly. Secretly, of course, because if someone else steps in and says, no, this isn't right, they're going to try to persecute them by asking them not to do so. That is to say to them, look, this is not yours to control. I'm in control here. You're not. So that's the answer to that question, but it also leads into something else. It leads into the political. What is going on here politically? Well, politically, what is going on here is that you have these people who are the pinnacle of nonconformists, the people who live in a way where there is no norm, and they want them to teach these children. Why? Because not only do they want them to teach these children that there is no norm and there is no normal, but they want to do so from the very beginning of their instruction, back to the time of kindergarten, so that they destroy their ability to recognize patterns itself. And so, what does this all have to do with storytelling, you may be saying? Well, here's the point. Here's the connection. To these quote-unquote progressive people, you and I, and really the vast majority of people in this world, are children. We are the great unwashed. We are the common herd. We are the child-minded people who make up most of the human society. And why? How can we be identified as such? Well, we're identified as such because we do not believe what these woke individuals believe. That is to say, we haven't been liberated from our ignorance like they have with this liberal ideal. That nothing has control over me. I am a sovereign individual. Only the things that I give the stamp of approval as having some control over me actually have any meaning. But here's the thing. They do recognize that we're in, at the very least, adult bodies, and they can't destroy our pattern recognition in the exact same way that they can do so for children. By the way, just look at these kids and how this entire system would play out on them. If you have these kids, and you have, let's say, one of these kids within the class who has a really good sense of what reality is, or has been taught morally differently than what the teacher is saying, what happens in that scenario where all the other kids become the flying monkeys of this teacher? If you have a kid that stands out, then he's the one that gets targeted. Exactly, that's what happens. This is the kid placing a target on their own back, and therefore they will then attack them. Attack them through the double means of shame and punishment. And there is absolutely no way this kindergartner or grade 4 can defend themselves against the teacher and the entire school system, especially when they're told that they have to keep this secret and are not allowed to tell anyone else, especially their parents. This is the exact same thing you see with social media right now. This is why it's so big. Social media is a shaming mechanism, and if you don't bow to the shaming mechanism and okay that this is the way you're supposed to think, then therefore you will be punished, which is to say you will not be able to give your opinion or anything else in any public forum. But again, the point being that we have to be taught, just like in that classroom. And the way that you teach people who have already gone through the system and already have this idea of pattern recognition and that it has some value, the way that you do that is through piling on them the message from every direction that there is no norm. This is why they need a minimum of 50% of these stories to be of this nature. They need to be with these pronoun people at the center and their lives at the center. Why? Because it is a story that shows you there is no normal. And here's the reason why. Storytelling fits so neatly into their plan. Because storytelling, as I'm always saying, is a representation of reality. And as both the ancients and the medievals knew, we as human beings are delighted by representations. And in some sense, we're delighted by it because we're pattern recognizers, because it harkens back to that early childhood way of learning through pattern recognition and representation. And so these quote-unquote progressive people are using a tool which harkens back to a childlike way of learning for each of us individuals, because it's not only a representation of reality, but it's also a rhetorical argument. So it's a way of learning something that harkens back to a childlike manner. And again, they think of us as children. And so they wish to teach us like children. And indeed, when we enjoy a story, we are being childlike in some way, because we need to drop our guard a little bit. We, of course, need to drop it, especially when you're dealing with something like science fiction and fantasy, because you need to engage your suspension of disbelief. And this is why story is so important to them. They are teaching us, the common herd of society, as if we were children, by the best means possible that they could teach us as if we were children, and using our innate pattern recognition to try to teach us that there is no such thing as pattern recognition. And this needs to be the majority of the message that you receive from everywhere. Again, it's not going to stop at 50%. They need a majority of everything telling you that there is no norm. That is what these stories are for. That is why they make these characters into pronoun people characters and make that the center of their story. That is the political purpose behind all of this, to ensure you understand there is no norm. That old idea that you have that there is pattern recognition and you can recognize these patterns and accept them and live according to them, no, that has to be destroyed. But again, let's move back to what the point of this entire thing is. Well, the entire point is that if they get you to recognize that there is no normal, and therefore they destroy your ability to recognize patterns in any way, and some of you may be saying, yeah, whatever. Well, I'm just looking at, again, the woman who is supposed to become the new Supreme Court Justice of the land, and she is saying she can't define what a woman is. That's the destruction of the ability to recognize even the most simple things within human existence as having a normal pattern, as having a definition. These people don't want you to have the ability to recognize any patterns at all. Why? Because once again, that pattern recognition allows you access to the system whereby you access virtue, which allows you to become fulfilled. That is to say, you have the power to fulfill yourself. But the point for them is, once they destroy your ability to recognize patterns in any way, they destroy your ability to see that endpoint, they destroy your ability to actually become fulfilled, and they rob you of the access to the power necessary to do that. Why? Because they're the only ones that are allowed to have power. And again, it will never be enough for these people. Most people would say, oh yeah, see, I look at these pronoun people and I would say, you just do your thing. I don't really agree with it, but you do your thing and I'll do mine over here. Again, to them, that's erasure. To them, you're being more of a person who persecutes them than a person who openly opposes them, because your persecution is A, something that is secret and under the surface, and B, you're trying to get them to take that kind of internal persecution onto themselves. This is why I say they don't define tolerance according to the old definition of tolerance, which is to say, I don't agree with this thing is wrong, but I will tolerate it. That is to say, I will put up with it. No, to them, that's persecution of the highest order. For them, tolerance is you must accept fully and completely everything that we say and everything that we are, or you're someone who is against us. And at the center of this destruction of pattern recognition is something quite simple. What they're trying to destroy within you, within me, within the vast majority of people in this world is the ability to think for yourself. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.